The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Eli Crawford decided he wanted nothing more to do with the past, and so he burned it without reading past the first line. He watched the paper curl at the edges, the ink turning from black to brown to ash in the small iron stove that sat in the corner of his one-room cabin on the outskirts of Redemption, Texas. The year was 1874, and the land outside was dry and flat, and honest in a way that people rarely were, and Eli preferred it to almost everything else in the world. The fire ate the letter quickly, the way fire always ate things that mattered, and when it was done, he poured himself a glass of water from the tin pitcher on his shelf and stood at the window and watched the dust devils spin across his land and tried not to think about Violet Dalton. He failed, of course. He always failed at that particular task. Violet Dalton had grown up in the same town as Eli, which was a town called Harlan's Creek that sat about 40 miles northeast of Redemption, up where the land was slightly greener, and the creek actually ran water most months of the year. They had known each other since they were children, had grown up alongside each other the way children did in small towns, sharing schoolrooms and church pews and summer afternoons by the water. But it was not until they were grown that anything between them became what it eventually became, and by the time it became that thing, the circumstances had conspired against them in ways that felt almost deliberately cruel. Eli had come to Redemption 3 years ago, in the spring of 1871, after a disagreement with his father over the family land that had grown ugly enough to leave permanent scars on both sides. His father had wanted to sell the east pasture to a railroad company that was expanding south, and Eli had believed with every fiber of his being that giving that land to the railroad was the same as giving it to men who cared nothing for the soil beneath their boots. They had argued for weeks. The argument had eventually ended with Eli loading his horse and his few belongings and riding south, and his father watching from the porch with a face that said nothing and everything all at once. He had found the land outside Redemption by accident, really, stopping for water at a creek and discovering that the parcel beside it was unclaimed and available for a modest fee at the county office in town. He had filed the papers, built the cabin with his own hands over the course of one blistering summer, and begun the work of making something from nothing, which was the kind of work that suited him. He had written to Violet twice in those first months. She had written back. Then he had written again, and she had written again, and somehow over the course of those letters something had shifted between them that had never quite been said aloud when they were in the same town. Words on paper had a way of making truth easier, Eli had found, and the truth was that he had loved Violet Dalton since he was 17 years old and had never once found the courage to say it plainly. The letters had continued for almost a year, and they had become the thing he looked forward to most, arriving at the Redemption post office folded and sealed and smelling faintly of the cedar drawer where she kept her stationery. She wrote beautifully. Not in a flowery or affected way, but in a direct and honest way that made him feel like she was sitting across a table from him, just talking, the way people talked when they had stopped pretending. And then his father had died. He had gotten word in the fall of 1872, a note from his cousin saying that Thomas Crawford had passed of a fever, and that the land and the debts and the whole complicated mess of it were now Eli's to deal with if he chose. He had ridden north to Harlan's Creek, spent 6 weeks settling what could be settled and releasing what could not be released, and during those 6 weeks, he had seen Violet every day, and something had happened between them that was bigger than letters, something that existed in the space between words, in the way she had looked at him across her mother's kitchen table, and the way he had reached for her hand one evening on the porch, and she had not pulled it away. He had left Harlan's Creek in December of that year with the understanding, or what he had believed to be an understanding, that things between them were moving towards something, that she would come south, that he would build something worth coming south to. He had been wrong about the understanding, or perhaps he had been wrong about himself. Because when he returned to redemption and began the work again, the old darkness had come back. It was not something he talked about easily. It was the thing that lived in the part of him that doubted, that believed he was not the kind of man who deserved good things, that the land and the work were enough, and that anything softer than that would only end in hurt. It was the voice his father had put in him without meaning to, the voice that said capable men stood alone, and that needing someone was a form of weakness. And so when Violet's letters had grown more direct, when she had finally written the thing she must have been building toward for months, the letter that said she was ready to come, that she wanted to come, that she was asking him plainly whether he wanted her to, he had held it in his hands for a long time. He had read it 3 times, and then he had put it in the stove. He had not written back. The silence after that had been its own kind of cruelty, and he knew it. He had let the weeks pass and the months pass and done nothing, and eventually the letters from Violet had stopped coming, which was the outcome he had told himself he wanted, and which felt instead like having a tooth pulled without whiskey, a pain that sat in the jaw long after the tooth was gone. That had been 8 months ago. Now it was the summer of 1874, and the letter that had arrived today had been the first one in all that time, and he had burned it before he could talk himself out of burning it, and he was standing at his window watching the dust and trying not to think about what the first line had said. The first line had said, "Eli, I know you burned the last one." He pressed his palm flat against the rough wood of the window frame and breathed slowly. Outside, the sky was turning the color of a bruise along the western horizon, the way it did some evenings in the Texas summer, all purple and gold and deeply indifferent to the troubles of men. His cattle were small dark shapes against the pale grass. His dog, a brown and white creature named Cobb, was lying in the yard doing nothing industriously. The windmill was turning. He had a good life. He had built it himself, every plank and every post. He had 40 head of cattle and a well that ran clean water and a neighbor 2 miles east named Marcus Webb, who was the closest thing to a friend he had in this part of the world. He had everything a man in his position in 1874 Texas was supposed to want. He was 26 years old and he was utterly miserable, and he deserved it entirely. 3 weeks passed. Then another letter came. He almost burned this one too. He had it in his hand, and the stove was hot from the morning fire, and the movement from hand to iron door was so habitual at this point that his arm actually started the motion before something stopped it. He was never entirely sure what stopped it. Maybe it was the memory of the first line of the burned letter, the way she had known, the way she had said it plainly and without accusation, just as a fact, the way Violet always stated facts. Or maybe it was the 8 months of silence, and the way that silence had settled into him like cold water settling into dry ground, filling all the low places. Or maybe it was simply that he was tired of being the man who burned things. He sat down at his table and he opened the letter. It was 4 pages, written in her clear and slightly slanted hand on paper that had been folded twice. He could tell by the slight waviness of some of the lines that she had been very careful, that she had drafted this somewhere and copied it neatly, that this letter had been considered and reconsidered before being sent. That care moved him in a way he had not expected. She did not begin with recriminations. She did not begin with hurt, though he knew the hurt was there. She began by telling him about the town. She wrote that Harlan's Creek had changed, that the railroad had finally come through and brought with it all the things railroads brought, more people and more noise and a new hotel, and a new set of arguments between the people who had been there first and the people who were arriving with ideas about what the place should become. She wrote about her mother's garden and the way the squash were coming in heavy this year. She wrote about the school teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Pierce, who had arrived in the spring and was already causing gentle controversy by teaching the children poetry alongside their arithmetic. And then, after 2 pages of that ordinary life described in her careful way, she wrote the thing she had come to say. She wrote, "I have been trying to understand why you did not answer. I have been trying to be angry about it, and I find that I cannot stay angry because I think I understand something, though I could be wrong. I think you burned my letters because you were afraid. Not of me, but of what saying yes would mean. I want you to know that I am not asking you for certainty. I am not asking you to have everything figured out. I am asking you for a chance to find out together whether what I believe is true is true. I am 24 years old, and I am not going to pretend I have unlimited time for a man to decide whether he can bring himself to be happy. But I am writing this letter because whatever is between us deserves at least an honest answer. If you burn this one too, I will understand that the answer is no. I would ask only that you have the courage to burn it deliberately this time, with intention, knowing that it is the answer you are choosing. Eli read that paragraph 4 times. He set the letter down on the table. He picked it up again. He walked to the window and back. Cobb raised his head from the yard and looked at him through the open door with the patient expression of a dog who has seen his person pace before and expects to see it again. Eli sat back down. He read the last page of the letter, which returned to ordinary things, which was its own kind of mercy. She wrote about the horses at her uncle's stable that she had been riding to help exercise. She wrote about a thunderstorm that had come through in May and knocked the old cottonwood by the creek halfway down. She wrote that she hoped his cattle were doing well and that she had heard from Marcus Webb's wife, who was a cousin of someone in Harlan's Creek, that his land was looking fine and that the well he had dug was one of the deepest in that part of the county. She had been asking about him. She had been keeping track of him from 40 miles away, through the sideways channels of small-town information, and she had put that in the letter not as pressure but simply as truth. He did not burn the letter. He held it for a long time in the evening light and then folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in the cedar box he kept under his bed where he stored the few things that mattered. His father's watch, a photograph of his mother, his land deed. The letter went in with those things. He did not sleep well that night. He lay awake listening to the coyotes' call from the ridge and the wind moving through the scrub grass and thought about what Violet had written. I am not asking you for certainty. She knew him, that was the thing. She had looked at him across her mother's kitchen table, and she had seen something, and she had been patient with it longer than he had any right to expect, and she was still being patient with it. But she was also being honest that patience was not infinite, and that honesty was more terrifying to him than any anger would have been. In the morning, he got up before the sun and fed the cattle and checked the fence along the north pasture, where a section had been pulling loose, and fixed it with the wire pliers and new staples he had bought in town last week. And when he came back to the cabin and made his coffee, he sat down at the table with paper and ink and wrote her back. It took him 4 attempts. The first 3 he crumpled and threw into the stove, which felt appropriate in a painful kind of way. The 4th he kept. He wrote, Violet, you were right that I burned the last one. You were also right about why. I have been sitting with this since yesterday, and I do not have pretty words for it. What I have is this. I would like to know if you would be willing to come to redemption. Not because I have everything figured out. I do not. But because I think if I let this pass, I will be the kind of fool I cannot respect in myself, and I have enough things about myself I cannot respect already. I have built something here. It is not large, but it is solid and it is honest, and there is room in it for more than just me if more than just me were willing to fill it. I am asking poorly, and I know it. But I am asking. He signed it with his name and his address and the date, June the 14th, 1874, and he rode into Redemption that same morning and put it in the post before he could change his mind. Then he went to the hardware store and bought a new set of hinges for the cabin door that had been sticking, and he went to the dry goods store and bought flour and coffee, and a bolt of blue calico that he told himself was for a practical purpose, and which he knew was not. And he rode home and fixed the door, and spent the rest of the day doing the ordinary work of his land, with the particular quality of alertness that comes from having done something irreversible. Redemption was a town of roughly 300 souls in the summer of 1874. the kind of town that had grown up fast around a water source and a few stubborn families, and was in the process of deciding what kind of place it wanted to become. There was a main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel called the Cartwright House, a saloon called the Red Dog, a church, a doctor's office, and a post office that doubled as a telegraph station. The sheriff was a man named Cal Briggs, who was generally fair and occasionally exasperated by the small dramas his town produced. There was a school that had been built the previous year, and a livery stable run by a Mexican man named Rodrigo Vasquez, who was one of the finest horsemen in the county, and who was paid considerably less than he was worth because of who he was, a fact that sat badly with several of the more decent residents of Redemption, and was simply accepted by the rest. Eli's land was 2 miles outside town, south along the creek road, and he came in twice a week generally for supplies and post. The ride took about 30 minutes on a good horse, and his horse, a bay gelding named Dust, was a good horse. He checked the post every time he rode in after sending his letter, which was more frequently than he normally would have, and Marcus Webb noticed and made a comment about it one afternoon when they ran into each other at the general store, and Eli gave him a look that closed the conversation, and Marcus, who was a perceptive man, smiled and said nothing more. 3 weeks after he had sent his letter, a reply came. The envelope was thicker than the last one. He did not open it in the post office. He put it in his coat pocket and rode home and sat at his table with his coffee, and opened it with the same care he might have given to something that could break. She had written yes. Not just yes, but a whole letter around the yes, explaining how she would arrange things, what she would need to do to close her affairs in Harlan's Creek, what she would bring and what she would leave, questions about the town and the land and the nearest church. Practical questions asked in her practical way, questions that told him she had already been thinking about this before he had written, that she had been sitting with the possibility of it the way you sit with something you want badly and are trying not to want too much. And at the end of the practical questions, in a paragraph that stood slightly apart from the rest, she wrote, "I want to be honest with you because I think that is the only way this works. I am coming to Redemption because I want to be there, not because I have no other options. I am not desperate, Eli. I am choosing. There is a difference and I need you to understand it." He read that paragraph twice and felt something shift in his chest like a stone that had been sitting in the wrong place, finally finding the right one. He wrote back the same evening. He wrote that he understood the difference and that he was glad she had said it. He wrote that he would have the house in order. He wrote that if she needed a recommendation for the stage line from Harlan's Creek, he could send the schedule, that the stage came through Redemption on Thursdays, and the ride from Harlan's Creek by way of the 2 connecting stages was approximately 2 days. He also wrote, and this was the line that cost him the most effort and which he wrote without crossing out, "I have been thinking about what you said in your last letter, about asking whether what you believe is true is true. I believe it is true. I have believed it for a long time and been a coward about it, and I am sorry for the 8 months, and I am sorrier for the letter I burned, and I will spend a reasonable amount of time being sorry, and then I would like to spend the rest of my time being something better than sorry." He sent that letter and then he went out to the barn and spent an hour with Dust doing nothing in particular, just standing with the horse in the way that sometimes helped him think. And when he came back in, he looked around the cabin and saw it the way someone else might see it, the rough walls and the single window and the plank floor and the sparse furniture. And he thought about the blue calico bolt he had bought on an impulse, and he took it from the shelf and measured the window and cut and hemmed curtains that evening by lamplight, which was the first domestic act he had performed in this cabin in 3 years of living in it. They looked decent. Not beautiful, but decent. The answer to his letter came in early August with her arrival date. She would come on the Thursday stage on the 14th of August, which was 5 weeks away. She would bring 2 trunks and her mother's mare if arrangements could be made for transport. Could he arrange for a stall at the livery? She trusted he could. He arranged it. He went to Rodrigo Vasquez at the livery and asked about a stall and a run, and Rodrigo said yes without hesitation and quoted him a fair price, and Eli paid for 6 months in advance, which was perhaps more advance than was necessary but which felt right. He also spent those 5 weeks doing work on the cabin that he had been putting off for reasons he recognized now as the same reason he had burned her letters, because making the cabin better had felt like admitting he wanted something better in it, and admitting that had felt dangerous. Now he built a second set of shelves along the east wall. He replaced the plank floor in the main room with a tighter set of boards he had milled himself from timber he hauled from the stands of cedar up by the ridge. He built a proper bed frame to replace the rough one he had been sleeping on, and filled a new tick with clean straw. He fixed the lean-to at the back of the cabin so it could serve as a proper covered porch. He put a latch on the door that worked. Marcus Webb came by twice during those weeks and watched all of this activity with the expression of a man who has privately won a bet with himself and said nothing about it, which was the finest kind of friendship. On the morning of August the 14th, Eli put on his good shirt and his clean hat and rode into Redemption and tied dust outside the post office and waited on the bench in front of the Cartwright house where you could see the stage road from the north. The stage was 40 minutes late, which was not unusual. He sat on the bench and watched the road and thought about the last time he had seen Violet, which was 2 years ago, December of 1872. Her standing on her mother's porch with her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and the way she had looked at him when he had said goodbye, as if she were memorizing something and wasn't sure whether she was happy or sad about it. He heard the stage before he saw it, the sound of the horses and the wheels, and the particular rattle that the Butterfield coaches made on this stretch of road. It came around the stand of mesquite at the edge of town in a cloud of dust, and pulled up in front of the Cartwright house with the driver calling out to the horses and the whole mechanism coming to a noisy and slightly undignified halt. 3 passengers got out. A man in a dark coat carrying a leather bag who was clearly a traveling salesman of some kind. An older woman who was met immediately by a younger woman running from the hotel. And then, last, Violet Dalton, stepping down from the stage with her hand on the rail and looking around at Redemption, Texas, with an expression of clear-eyed assessment that he recognized immediately and completely. She was 24 years old, and she was not what he had been picturing during the 5 weeks of waiting, though he could not have said exactly what he had been picturing. She was taller than he remembered, or perhaps he had simply forgotten the specifics of her. Dark hair pinned up under a hat that had suffered somewhat from 2 days of travel, a gray traveling dress that was dusty at the hem. Brown eyes that swept the main street of Redemption with the efficient gaze of someone cataloging information, and then found him standing by the bench and stopped. He lifted his hat. It was not a particularly heroic gesture, but it was honest. She walked toward him and he walked toward her, and they met in the middle of the street, which was technically also where Rodrigo Vasquez was trying to drive a buckboard, and Rodrigo gave them a patient look and steered around them without comment. "You came," Eli said. "It was not eloquent. It was the first thing that came out." "I wrote you that I was coming," Violet said. "I generally do what I say I am going to do." "I know you do." He turned his hat in his hands. "You look well." "I look like I have been on a stage for 2 days," she said. But there was something in the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile yet and was moving in that direction. "Your mother's mare came on the freight wagon. Rodrigo Vasquez at the livery has the stall ready. That is good. She will be unhappy from the journey." She looked at him steadily. "Are you going to keep talking about the horse, or are you going to say something to me?" Eli Crawford. He had rehearsed something. He had stood in front of the window of his cabin on several evenings and said words in various orders, and none of them had felt right. And standing here in the middle of Redemption's main street with Rodrigo's buckboard creaking away behind him, they felt even less right. And so he said none of the rehearsed things and said instead, "I am very glad you are here." I know I did not make it easy to come, and I am sorry for that. I would like to spend considerable time making up for it if you will let me." Violet looked at him for a moment with the expression that she had sometimes in her letters, the one where he could tell she was weighing something carefully. Then she said, "That is a reasonable start." He got her trunks down from the stage with the help of the driver and arranged them in the bed of the buckboard he had borrowed from Marcus for the occasion, and he helped her up onto the seat and climbed up beside her and took the reins, and they drove out of Redemption toward the creek road and his land, and neither of them spoke for the first quarter mile, which was comfortable in a way that surprised him. "Tell me about the land," she said finally. He told her. He told her about the 40 acres along the creek, and the well, and the cattle, and the way the light came off the water in the mornings. He told her about the ridge to the north where the cedar stands were, and the flat pasture land to the south. He told her about the neighbors, Marcus and his wife Clara, who had 2 children and a good kitchen garden, and old Bert Hanley, who was 3 miles west and had been out here longer than anyone, and who said little but whose word was reliable. She listened the way she always had, without interrupting, with the quality of attention that meant she was actually absorbing what was being said rather than waiting for her turn to speak. "And the town?" she asked. "You said there is a church. First Methodist, Reverend Holly's. He is adequate. There is also a Catholic church on the south end of town that Rodrigo and a few others attend. A school, built last year. The teacher is a woman from Galveston, Miss Annie Travers. She is young, but she seems capable." Violet nodded. He could see her building her picture of the place, fitting what he was telling her against what she had already imagined, adjusting. "You built the curtains yourself," she said when they pulled up to the cabin and she looked at the window. "I did. They are slightly uneven." "I know. I can fix that." He got down and helped her down and opened the door and let her walk into the cabin first. He watched her look around at what he had built, the new floor and the shelves and the bed frame and the porch, and he watched her face do the thing where it went still when she was deciding what she thought, and he waited. "It is smaller than I expected," she said. "It is. But it is solid." She pressed her hand against the wall. "You built this yourself, every board." She turned and looked at him with an expression that had something in it he could not quite read, something layered the way the letters had been layered. "It is a good house, Eli." He released a breath he had been holding for some time. They ate supper that evening at the table he had extended with an extra plank to make room for 2. And Violet had brought a few things from Harlan's Creek in her trunk, including some dried herbs that she hung from a rafter hook above the stove, and a small framed photograph of her mother that she set on the new shelf along the east wall. And these 2 small acts of claiming space made the cabin feel different in a way that was difficult to articulate but unmistakable. She slept in the cabin's only bed, and he made a pallet in the lean-to. And when he said good night to her at the door of the bedroom, she looked at him and said, "You are not going to make this strange, are you?" "I am going to try not to," he said. "Good," she said. "We have enough to manage without making things strange." He lay on his pallet and listened to the coyotes and the wind and thought that she was right about that, and that she was right about most things, and that this thought did not frighten him the way it might have once. The days that followed were a period of careful and genuine getting to know each other, which was a different thing from having known each other as children, or from having corresponded by letter, or from those 6 December weeks 2 years ago. This was the daily texture of a shared life, which had its own particular demands and revelations. Violet was practical in ways that complemented his practicality and occasionally surprised it. She looked at the kitchen garden he had been half-heartedly maintaining and made a plan for it on her 3rd morning there, laid out with stakes and string, and by the end of the week she had reorganized it entirely and planted 3 things he had not thought to plant. She was also unafraid of work, the physical daily labor of a ranch life, and when she asked him to show her things, she learned them without complaint and asked intelligent questions. She was also direct in ways that were sometimes startling. On her 5th morning, she said to him over breakfast, "I want to talk about what happened." The 8 months. Not to make you feel worse about it, but because I think we need to have said it plainly before we can move past it. He set down his coffee. All right. I was hurt, she said. When you did not write back, I went through a period of thinking I had been wrong about you entirely. I was angry at myself more than at you because I thought I had been foolish. She looked at him evenly. Then I decided that I might have been wrong about the circumstances but not about the person, and that is why I wrote again. But I need you to understand that I did not come here with no hurt. I brought the hurt with me. I just did not let it be the only thing I brought. Felt the weight of this with full clarity. That is fair, he said, and it is more generosity than I earned. No, she said, it is not generosity. It is a choice I made for my own reasons because I believe this is worth the risk. She held his gaze. What I need from you is not apology at this point. I need you to not run from this again. If something frightens you, I need you to tell me that it frightens you rather than going quiet. Can you do that? I do not find it easy, he said honestly. But yes, I can try. Trying is enough, she said, and picked up her coffee again, and the conversation moved on to the practical, which was her way of signaling that the difficult part was done, and now they could continue. He found himself wanting to be near her. It was a particular and quiet wanting, different from the sharp kind he had known before, less like wanting a thing and more like wanting to stay in a certain quality of light. He found reasons to work on the same side of the property she was working on. He found himself listening for her voice, and feeling the cabin feel larger and colder on the 2 afternoons. She went into town with Clara Webb to learn the layout of the place and meet people. Clara Webb was delighted by Violet, which was no surprise to anyone who knew Clara, who was the kind of woman who was delighted by most good things. She took Violet around Redemption with the enthusiasm of a person who has been waiting a long time for someone interesting to arrive, and she introduced her to Miss Annie Travers, the school teacher, and to the Reverend Hollies, and to the woman who ran the dry goods counter whose name was Betty Chalmers, and who knew everything about everybody in a 20-mile radius, and was not shy about sharing it. Violet came home from these excursions with the kind of particular energy she had when she had been learning things. She told him about the town's politics, which she had apparently extracted from Betty Chalmers in under an hour, the ongoing argument between the established ranching families and the new people who wanted to develop the town, the question of whether there was going to be a proper bank, the railroad spur that was being proposed to connect Redemption to the main line. She told him about Miss Annie Travers, who was apparently very capable and very lonely and deserved better company than she was currently getting. You have learned more about this town in 3 days than I have in 3 years, he said. You were not paying attention, she said, not unkindly. I was paying attention to the land. You can pay attention to both. He was beginning to understand that this was how she would change him, not through argument or pressure, but through the steady example of a person who engaged with the world fully and expected others to do the same. It was on a Sunday in late August, 3 weeks after her arrival, that something happened which changed the terms of everything between them in a way that was sudden and unexpected and entirely welcome. They had ridden up to the Cedar Ridge together that morning, ostensibly to look at the timber stands and decide which trees might be harvested for fencing in the fall. It was the kind of ride he had been making alone for 3 years, and making it with Violet beside him on her mother's mare, whose name was Ginny and who was a fine-tempered chestnut, was different in a way he had difficulty cataloging. The land looked like itself, which was something he loved about it, but it also looked like it was being seen fresh, because she was seeing it, and her seeing it made him see it differently. They stopped at the top of the ridge where you could see for miles south, across his land and across the neighboring parcels and all the way to the pale smudge of Redemption in the distance. This is why you came here, she said. She was not asking. She was stating it. Yes, he said, I understand it. She was looking out across the distance with that still expression. When I left Harlan's Creek, I thought I might regret it. I thought I might feel like I had given something up. A pause. I do not feel that. He looked at her. What do you feel? She turned to look at him with the directness that was entirely her own. "I feel like I arrived somewhere rather than left somewhere, which is either wisdom or foolishness, and I will know which by the end of the year," he said without planning it, without the rehearsal and revision and the crossing out that his letters always required. "I love you, Violet." She looked at him for a long moment with the measuring expression that preceded every important thing she said. "I know you do," she said. "I have known it for about 4 years. I was waiting for you to catch up with yourself." "I am slow," he admitted. "You are extremely slow," she agreed, but she was smiling now fully, the smile that he had been catching in glimpses for 3 weeks and which was, in its full form, the most disorienting thing he had encountered in a life that had not been short on difficult terrain. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand the way he had taken it 2 years ago on her mother's porch, and she let him hold it the way she had let him then, and they sat on the ridge above his land in the late August heat and said nothing for a while, which was the most comfortable silence he had ever sat in. He asked her to marry him 2 weeks later. He did not do it dramatically. He had thought about dramatic and decided it was not quite right for either of them. He did it at the supper table on a Wednesday evening, with the lamp turned up and the smell of the beans she had made from the garden coming from the stove, and Cobb asleep in the corner. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it plainly, without a lot of performance, because I think you would find the performance irritating." She looked at him across the table. "That is a reasonable preamble. I would like for you to marry me. Not because it is expected or because of the arrangement of our situation, but because I want to build this life with you specifically and not with anyone else, and I would like that to be the formal and stated fact of things." Violet set down her fork. She looked at him for a long moment with that measuring look, and then she said, "Yes, that is the answer I came here to give when you were finally ready to ask it." "I am sorry it took until September," he said. "I am not," she said. "You needed the time, and I needed to see the place and know that I was choosing it clearly and not out of sentiment." A small pause. "I am choosing it clearly." They were married on October the 3rd, 1874, in the First Methodist Church in Redemption, with Reverend Hollies officiating and Marcus and Clara Webb as witnesses, and a small congregation that included most of the people Violet had met in her first weeks in town and a few of Eli's neighbors who came in from the outlying lands. Rodrigo Vasquez came and sat in the back row, and Eli was glad he was there. Betty Chalmers cried, which surprised no one. Violet wore a dress she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding from a bolt of deep blue fabric she had found at the dry goods store, and she had her dark hair pinned up with 2 ivory combs that had been her mother's. Eli wore his good coat and a new hat that Clara Webb had suggested he get, and which he had gone to buy somewhat reluctantly, and which was, he had to admit, a significant improvement over the old one. The ceremony was not long. Reverend Hollies was a man who understood that brevity and sincerity were not incompatible. When he got to the part about speaking now or forever holding your peace, there was a moment of genuine silence that settled over the small church, the good kind of silence that comes from a room full of people who are actually paying attention. And Eli looked at Violet standing beside him, and she looked back at him with her clear brown eyes, and he thought that he had been a fool for a long time and was now, definitively, choosing not to be. He kissed her at the end of the ceremony, and she kissed him back, and the small congregation made a sound of collective warmth, and Clara Webb wiped her eyes, and Marcus clapped him on the shoulder afterward in the kind of way that conveyed substantial amounts of wordless feeling. The reception was in the yard of the Cartwright house, which Mrs. Cartwright had offered because she had a soft spot for weddings, and had, she said, been watching that young man from the creek road long enough to form an opinion. Tables were set out, and Clara and Betty and 2 other women from town had contributed food, and there was coffee, and there was a man named Pete Flores who played the fiddle sitting on the hotel porch and played it very well. Eli danced with his wife, who was a better dancer than he was, which she had the grace not to emphasize. He watched her talk to people and felt the particular warmth of watching someone you love be themselves fully, the specific pleasure of seeing her direct and clear way with people work its effect on a room. She was not performing. She never performed. She was just exactly herself, and people responded to that with the instinctive relief that real things always produced in people who had been surrounded by imitations. Later in the evening, when some of the guests had gone and Pete Flores was playing something slower, she came to stand beside him where he had been leaning against the post of the hotel porch watching the remaining dancers. "You are very quiet," she said. "I am happy," he said. "I am quiet when I am happy. You will get used to it." "I already have," she said, and leaned her shoulder against his. Above them the sky was the vast and brilliant dark that the Texas plains produced on clear October nights, more stars than you could count or name, the Milky Way a smear of pale light from horizon to horizon. The fiddle played. The last dancers moved in the lamplight. His wife stood beside him with her shoulder warm against his. He had burned the last letter she had sent. She had written another. He had not burned that one. He had been, he thought, just barely smart enough. The fall of 1874 moved into winter with the particular quality of that first season of a shared life, the process of learning someone in daily proximity, which was its own education entirely. Eli learned that Violet was sharpest in the mornings and needed strong coffee to make the transition to sharper, that she had opinions about the organization of small spaces that were specific and correct, that she read at night by the lamp for longer than was good for her eyes, and that telling her this produced a response he learned quickly not to repeat. He learned that she hummed while she worked, not songs exactly but a kind of melodic thinking aloud, and that the sound of it had become within a few weeks one of the sounds he most associated with the feeling of being home. Violet learned that he woke before dawn naturally, and was best left to the first hour of the morning without conversation, that he expressed displeasure not with anger but with a particular quality of silence, that once you knew it was clear as a bell, that he was unexpectedly and secretly good with small things, with small repairs and small adjustments and small kindnesses, the kind of man who fixed the thing that was bothering you before you had said it was bothering you. She also learned over the course of that fall that the darkness he had written about without naming it, the thing that had made him burn her letters, was not gone. It appeared sometimes in the evenings when the work was done, and there was nothing to occupy the part of his mind that, left idle, turned on him. She learned to see it coming. She learned that on those evenings what helped was not comfort, which he found smothering, but engagement, direct conversation or a task they could do side by side, something that required him to be present to something other than the interior argument. She told him once, on a cold November evening when she could see it on him, that she thought it was the loneliness of years that had done it to him, that the particular isolation of what he had built here was fine for a strong man, but that strong men were also capable of being damaged by too much solitude, and that she was not saying this as criticism but as observation. He sat with this for a while, and then said that he thought she was probably right. "You are getting better at admitting that," she said. "I am trying," he said. "I know," she said, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his in the direct way she had, without sentiment, just the plain fact of her hand on his, and that was enough. By December she had made the cabin more itself than it had ever been in Eli's 3 years of occupying it. Not through decoration, which was not particularly her interest, but through the accumulation of daily life, the garden she had extended and organized and put to bed for the winter with the promise of spring, the kitchen that now ran in a way that made sense, the small refinements to the shelves and storage, the second chair she had asked Eli to build and which he had built to her specifications, and which was better than his own chair, the photograph of her mother on the shelf, and a small botanical drawing that had been a wedding gift from Clara Webb on the wall by the door. It felt, for the first time, like a home rather than a dwelling. Eli noticed this every time he came in from the cold, the way the cabin received him differently now. Winter in that part of Texas was not the killing cold of northern places, but it had its own edge, and the nights were long and the wind had teeth, and the time indoors was more than the summer allowed. They talked more than Eli had talked to anyone in years. She read to him, sometimes from the books she had brought in her trunks, and he listened with a quality of attention he had rarely given to anything that was not the land. And he found that he was interested in more things than he had known, that she expanded the territory of what he thought about. In January of 1875, she told him she was expecting a child, standing in the kitchen on a cold morning with the directness she brought to all important announcements, and his response was to sit down at the table without saying anything for a full minute, which was apparently the correct response because she sat down across from him and waited without concern, understanding this was the way he processed large things. Then he said, "When? August or September," she said. "I am not certain yet." He looked at her across the table. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am not delicate, Eli. I am not going to shatter." "I know you are not," he said. "I am going to fuss anyway." "I expected nothing less," she said, and there was the corner of the mouth expression moving toward the full smile again. He did fuss. He fussed in the particular way that was available to him, which was the physical expression of concern through work. He extended the cabin through the spring, adding a proper second room on the eastern side where there had been only a partial lean-to, with a window that faced the creek and new plank floors and a door between it and the main room that could be closed against the cold. He built a cradle over the course of February evenings by the lamp, working slowly and carefully with the best pieces of cedar from the ridge, sanding it smooth in a way he did not normally bother with on functional objects because this was not exactly functional in the ordinary sense. Violet watched the cradle taking shape without comment for the first 2 weeks and then said on a Friday evening, "That is going to be beautiful." "It is functional," he said. "It is both," she said. He worked another week on the cradle, and then it was done, and it sat in the corner of the new room looking exactly like what it was, solid and smooth and made with the particular quality of care that goes into things built for people you love. And he felt about it the way he felt about the best fence lines on his land, the satisfaction of a thing done right. Spring came with the particular urgency of the Texas spring, which was fast and almost aggressive in its greenness, the land going from the dun colors of winter to something vivid in what felt like a matter of days. Violet's garden came up with the force of her fall work and her early spring planting, and she managed it with the precision she brought to everything while also, as her pregnancy progressed, accepting more help from Clara Webb and from Eli, though she was careful about what she asked him to do in the garden because she had opinions. The town continued to grow around them. The bank that had been debated opened in March, a small brick building on the main street that gave redemption a different kind of weight, the kind that came from permanence. 2 new families arrived from Missouri in April, adding to the school's enrollment and to Betty Chalmers's intelligence network. A second saloon opened, which the Reverend Hollies deplored and which the general population accepted with the pragmatism of frontier people. There was trouble in April that Eli was involved in peripherally, though not by choice. A man named Gideon Rourke, who had a spread about 5 miles northeast of Eli's land, had been having a boundary dispute with one of the newer arrivals, a man named Cole Fisher who had come from Kansas with money and a willingness to use it to establish himself quickly. The dispute had escalated over the winter and came to a head one April morning when Fisher's hired men had torn down a section of Rourke's fence, claiming it was encroaching on what Fisher's land deed stated was his property. Sheriff Cal Briggs had been trying to mediate it, and Marcus Webb had asked Eli to come with him to serve as a third perspective at a meeting at the sheriff's office, since Eli knew the land in that area well and had surveyed the ridge property himself when he bought it. Eli went and sat in the sheriff's office and looked at the competing land deeds and said plainly what he thought the boundary was, and his reading matched Rourke's, and the sheriff accepted this and communicated it to Fisher. Fisher was not happy. He made the kind of comment afterward, in the street outside the sheriff's office, that was designed to be threatening without being specific enough to act on, the way certain men were practiced at doing. Eli looked at him and said nothing, which was sometimes more effective than saying something, and Marcus put his hand briefly on Eli's arm and they walked away. "He will cause more trouble," Marcus said. "He might," Eli said. "But not about that boundary line." He came home and told Violet about it, and she listened with the focused attention she gave to anything that might affect their land or their livelihood, asked 3 precise questions, and then said, "Watch that man. He is the kind who does not accept being publicly wrong." "I know what kind he is," Eli said. "Good," she said, and returned to the garden she was examining for aphids. He did watch Fisher. As much as a man 2 miles south with his own considerable work could watch a man he had no direct business with. Mostly what he saw was Fisher buying up land aggressively over the next few months, acquiring parcels from people who were willing to sell and creating the kind of consolidated holding that in most places meant the person holding it believed the rules were for other people. In June, Fisher made an approach to Eli directly, riding up to the gate of his property on a fine gray horse with 2 of his men behind him, looking as if he had decided to be friendly about things. He offered to buy Eli's parcel. He offered considerably more than it was worth, which was the kind of offer that was designed to be insulting in its assumption about what a man could be bought for. Eli said no. He said it once pleasantly and offered no further discussion. Fisher rode away and Violet, who had been watching from the porch, came down the steps and stood beside Eli watching the dust settle after Fisher's horses. "He will come back," she said. "He will come back," Eli agreed. "What is his goal, do you think? Is he building to sell to the railroad?" Eli looked at her. He had been thinking this himself. "The railroad spur. If someone holds a significant portion of the land along the proposed route, the railroad has to negotiate with them rather than with 10 separate small owners. So he is positioning himself," she said. "That is what I think. Then the question is whether the railroad comes and when." She thought for a moment. "Marcus would know more about the railroad's timeline than we would. Ask him." He asked Marcus, who knew somewhat more and whose wife knew considerably more because Betty Chalmers had told her, and the combined intelligence suggested that the railroad survey was expected in the fall. This was useful to know. Eli put it in the back of his mind and continued his work, and kept his property in the clear and excellent condition that would make any survey straightforward, and resolved to deal with Fisher if and when Fisher required dealing with. July was hot in the way July in Texas was hot, which was total and merciless, and Violet's pregnancy was advanced enough by mid-July that the heat was an additional discomfort that she did not complain about but which was evident. He moved her chair to the coolest corner of the new room and rigged an awning outside the east window to shade the afternoon sun, and brought creek water in extra quantities, and said nothing about any of this, which she accepted with a look that said she noticed what he was doing even if neither of them named it. She kept working. She moderated what she did, which she had agreed to with the doctor in Redemption, a young man named Dr. Haynes who had arrived in the spring and who had been Violet's choice for the birth because she had asked him several careful questions and found his answers satisfactory. But she kept the garden going, and she kept the kitchen running, and she kept reading at night, and she kept making the decisions about the domestic landscape of their life with a precision that was entirely her own. In late July, there was a brief and clarifying confrontation with Cole Fisher that resolved the question of what he was capable of. 2 of his hired men came onto the south edge of Eli's property and tore down a section of fence, the mirror image of what they had done to Rourke in April. Eli found the damage the following morning and went directly to the sheriff's office in Redemption, filed a report, and then went back and repaired the fence himself. Cal Briggs came out that afternoon and looked at the location of the damage and then rode over to Fisher's property, and had a conversation Eli was not present for. But the result was that the fence was not disturbed again after that. Eli suspected the conversation had included a specific mention of the territorial court in Austin and the kind of fines and legal complications that could attach to a man who made a habit of property destruction. And Fisher was apparently smart enough to calculate that the legal exposure was not worth the marginal leverage. The railroad survey team came in September, a few weeks after Violet had their son. The boy arrived on a Friday morning in early September of 1875, after a labor that was not long by the standards of labors, though Eli spent most of it in the yard doing unnecessary things with tools while Dr. Haynes and Clara Webb were inside. And when Clara came to the door and said he could come in now, he walked through the door of the new room and saw Violet propped against the pillows with an expression of deep exhaustion and complete satisfaction, and the baby in her arms. And he stopped in the door for a moment because the sight of it was one of those things the mind needed a second to absorb. She looked up at him. "Come and see your son," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was red and wrinkled and astonishingly small and was making a noise that was not quite a cry and not quite anything he had a name for. He looked at Violet. "He is healthy?" he asked. "He is perfect," she said. "Dr. Haynes confirms it." A slight pause. "I am also fine, in case you were going to ask." "I was about to ask," he said. "You are getting faster," she said. But she leaned slightly toward him, and he put his arm around her, and she let her head rest against his shoulder for a moment, which was the most fully herself he had ever seen her be, the quiet she allowed herself when the work was done. They named the boy Thomas James Crawford, Thomas for Eli's father, because in the years since his father's death Eli had arrived at a peace with the old man that only distance and his own growth as a man had made possible, and James for Violet's father, who had died when she was 12 and whose absence she had carried quietly all her life. Thomas James Crawford was a solid and cheerful baby who slept reasonably and grew visibly, and had his mother's directness in his face even before he had words to express it. Eli held him in the evenings when the work was done, sitting in the chair on the porch of the cabin with the baby on his chest and the land spreading out before him in the autumn light. And this was the time of day he thought most clearly about how far he had come from the man who had burned a letter rather than answer it. The railroad survey confirmed what they had suspected. The proposed spur would run through the northern section of land in the area, closer to Rourke and Fisher's properties than to Eli's, which was a relief. Cole Fisher managed to sell a portion of his acquired land to the railroad at the price he had been angling for, which meant he had been right about the opportunity, even if his methods had been objectionable. He departed the area in the spring of 1876, bought out and moving on to whatever he did next, and his departure was not mourned by the people who remained. Rourke, whose land the fence dispute had been about, stayed and proved to be a decent neighbor in the way that people who have been through a common difficulty sometimes prove to be. He and Eli developed the comfortable and practical kind of friendship between neighboring ranchers, the kind built on the exchange of information and the occasional shared labor of the larger jobs neither man could do alone. Eli expanded the herd to 60 head in the spring of 1876, buying 10 additional cattle from a rancher near San Antonio who was selling down before relocating to New Mexico, and then adding another 10 in the fall from a sale in Redemption. The land could support it, the grass coming back well from the careful rotation he had been managing, and he had the water. It was the right size for a two-person operation, and the work he and Violet did together had the efficiency of two people who understood each other. Violet took on a role in the town that grew naturally from who she was. She became one of the main organizers of the school's support committee, working alongside Miss Annie Travers to ensure the school had adequate books and materials, raising money from the town's merchants with the combination of directness and charm that she deployed so effectively. She also began, quietly and without announcement, to help a few of the women in outlying areas who had less access to town, taking them supplies or information they needed. The simple practical solidarity of someone who understood that the frontier was harder for some than others. She made a particular point of this with the few Mexican families in the area who were often treated as invisible by the broader community, including Rodrigo Vasquez at the livery, who had kept her mother's mare beautifully through the 2 years Ginny had been in his stall, and who was the finest horseman in the county, and who everyone knew it and few people said aloud. Violet said it aloud to people clearly, which caused some mild discomfort in which she regarded as the appropriate response to mild discomfort. "You are going to make enemies," Eli told her once, not as a warning but as an observation. "I have made enemies," she said calmly. "They are the correct enemies to have." He could not argue with this. He did not try. In the fall of 1876, Violet told him she was expecting again, with the same directness she had brought to the first announcement, standing in the kitchen in the morning with her coffee. And this time he did not sit down in silence for a full minute but instead said, "When?" Within approximately 15 seconds, which she acknowledged as an improvement. "May or June," she said. "Tell Dr. Haynes," he said. "I already have," she said. "Of course you have," he said. She gave him the smile that was entirely her own and returned to her coffee. The winter of 1876 into 1877 was the harshest they had had since Eli came to Redemption, a cold that set in hard in December and did not give up until March, with 2 significant snowfalls that were unusual for this part of Texas and which required sustained work to keep the cattle through. Marcus Webb's southernmost pasture flooded in the January thaw, and Eli and Rourke both came out to help him move the cattle to higher ground, working in the cold water and mud with the horses, the kind of work that was miserable in the moment, and that built the foundation of the relationships between men who worked the same kind of land. Clara Webb brought hot food out in a wagon at midday, and Violet came with her, despite being 6 months along and despite Eli's expression when she climbed up onto the wagon that said everything he chose not to say, and she looked at that expression and said, "I am not made of glass," and Clara needed help with the food. He did not argue. He also spent the ride back that evening positioned between the wagon and the coldest wind in a way that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with instinct. And Violet noticed and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of communication. Their daughter arrived in May of 1877, quick and decided about coming into the world, as if she had somewhere to be. Dr. Haynes said it was one of the most straightforward deliveries he had managed in his 3 years of practice, and Clara said the baby had her mother's look about her, which meant she looked like she was already deciding things. They named her Ruth Eli Crawford, Ruth for Eli's mother who had died when he was 8 and whose face he carried more clearly in his memory than almost anything else from his childhood, and Eli for an aunt of Violet's who had been the first woman in her family to learn to read, and who had passed that habit and that value to everyone around her. Ruth Eli Crawford was loud and opinionated and grew into her looks over the first months of her life. And by the time she was sitting up on her own, she had the clear-eyed and direct gaze of her mother in a face that otherwise had a great deal of her father in it, the set of the jaw and the particular quality of attention. And Eli held her on the porch in the evenings, the way he held Thomas, and felt the particular expansion that a second child brings. The way love proved to be not a fixed quantity, but something that grew to fill what was needed. Thomas, who was nearly 2 by the time Ruth arrived, accepted his sister with the serious interest of a small person encountering a new phenomenon, examined her at length, and then returned to his primary project, which was attempting to follow his father everywhere on the property with the short-legged determination of a child who had decided that the outside world was his true home. Eli built a second cradle. He made it from oak this time, some of which he had been holding in the barn for a project he had not yet determined, and it was better than the cedar one had been, which was the way of second attempts when you knew what you were doing. Violet looked at it when he brought it in and ran her hand along the smooth side and said, "You have gotten better at this." "Second attempt," he said. "Yes," she said. "Second attempts tend to be better." She looked at him with something in her expression that referenced more than the cradle, and he understood that and held her gaze with the steadiness he had built over 3 years of learning how to hold it. The spring of 1877 was generous in the way that springs following hard winters often were, as if the land had been building something under the cold that needed only warmth to release it. The grass came up rich and thick, and the garden Violet put in was the best it had been, and the creek ran strong through May and into June, and the cattle were fat and healthy, and the 60 head had become 68 with spring calves. Marcus Webb, riding over one late June afternoon to return a tool he had borrowed in February and talk about the question of whether to extend the fence line along the shared property boundary before fall, looked around at Eli's property with its extended cabin and its well-managed land and its organized garden, and the small figures of Thomas toddling after Eli's heels, while Eli checked the fence along the yard and said to Violet, who had come out to the porch with the baby, "I thought that man was going to be a hermit until he died. He was the most thoroughly alone person I had ever met." "He was not alone," Violet said. "He was lonely. There is a large difference." "You would know," Marcus said. "I would know," she said. That summer, Eli began teaching Thomas the land. He was not quite 3, which was early, but Eli had decided that you could not begin too early with the things that mattered, and the land was the thing that mattered most to him, and he wanted to give his son the same gift it had given him, which was the gift of understanding what you were standing on. He showed him the soil and the water and the grass, and explained what each one meant in a language a not quite 3-year-old could absorb, and Thomas watched and listened with his mother's quality of attention, which was substantial. Violet watched this with a particular warmth. She told him one evening on the porch, with Ruth asleep in her arms and Thomas already asleep inside, that watching him with Thomas was one of the things she had not known to expect, that she had come here knowing what she believed about him, but that believing and seeing were different and that seeing was better. He said, "I was afraid of it, being a father. I was not sure I knew how." "You are learning," she said. "I am always learning," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said about himself in some time. "Yes," she said, "that is one of the things I love about you." She leaned her head against his shoulder in the easy way she had by now, the comfort of 2 people who had spent 3 years building the habit of each other. "You were worth the second letter." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair, which smelled of cedar and the outdoors. "You were worth about 40 years of second letters," he said. "I hope it does not take 40 years, she said, with the smile in her voice. "No," he said. "I think we are past the burning stage." "I sincerely hope so," she said, and they sat together on the porch of the home they had built between them while the Texas night settled in all around, the sky turning its vast and brilliant dark, the stars appearing one by one and then by hundreds, the coyotes beginning their distant conversation on the ridge, the land breathing in the slow way of land in summer, the windmill turning, Cobb asleep in the yard, everything in its place and all of it, exactly what it was supposed to be. In the fall of 1877, Marcus Webb proposed that the neighboring ranchers form a cooperative arrangement for the cattle drive to San Antonio, which would reduce the cost for each of them and allow them to negotiate a better price at the stockyards. Eli agreed, and so did Rourke, and old Bert Hanley from the West Parcel surprised everyone by coming in to the meeting at Marcus's place and agreeing as well, saying he had been doing the drive alone for 15 years and was not getting younger. The drive was planned for October, which would take Eli away from the ranch for approximately 2 weeks. He prepared for it methodically through September, making sure everything on the property was in the best possible order, the fences sound, the well clear, the winter supply of wood stacked, the the barn organized for Violet's management in his absence. Violet watched all of this preparation with the patience of a woman who understood the economies of ranching life and who had been thinking ahead about how to manage things in his absence. And on the evening before he left, she sat across from him at the table, and they went through the list of what was where, and who to go to for what and what to do if something went wrong. And it was the most practical conversation imaginable, and also, in its care and its trust, one of the most intimate they had had. "Come back with the money and with yourself intact," she said when they had finished the list. "I will do my best on both counts," he said. "I know you will." She reached across the table in her direct way and put her hand over his. "I did not bring myself and the children all this way for you to get yourself gored by a steer in San Antonio. The concern is touching," he said. "I am full of concerns," she said. "They are all practical." "I know," he said, and turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a while in the lamplight while the night outside was full of the sounds of the Texas autumn, and he thought about all the evenings he had sat at this table alone before she came, and found that those evenings felt like a different man's life, which in a great many ways they had been. The drive went well. The cattle arrived in San Antonio in good condition, and the price was better than the previous years, and the cooperative arrangement had worked as Marcus had predicted, the shared labor and shared negotiating position producing a result none of them could have managed alone. Eli came home after 16 days with the money folded in the inside pocket of his coat and dust moving with the tired precision of a horse that knew it was heading for its own stall. He came up the creek road in the late afternoon light and saw the cabin from a distance, the smoke from the stove, the garden put to bed for winter, the lean-to porch, the blue calico curtains in the window that were still slightly uneven, and he felt the particular pull of a place that had become home in the truest sense, not just the structure but the life inside it. Thomas was in the yard and saw him coming before anyone else did, and ran toward him with the full-body enthusiasm of a 3-year-old who has been told his father is coming home, stumbling over the uneven ground and maintaining his trajectory by sheer force of will. And Eli swung down from dust and caught him up and held him against his chest, and the boy grabbed his coat in both fists and held on. Violet came to the porch door with Ruth on her hip, and she looked at him coming across the yard with Thomas, and her expression was the one he loved best of all her expressions, the one that was not the smile yet, but was the thing that the smile came from, the recognition and the warmth and the absolute certainty of two people who have chosen each other past all doubt. "You made good time," she said. "Good weather south of the balcons," he said, and came up the porch steps, and Ruth reached for him, and he took her from Violet's hip and held both children and leaned in and kissed his wife. And she kissed him back with Thomas squirming between them and Ruth grabbing his ear, and it was not elegant and it was perfect. He gave her the money that evening, and she sat at the table and counted it with the focused attention she gave to numbers, then looked up and said it was enough to expand the herd another 10 head and still have a reserve through winter, which matched what he had calculated on the ride home, and they agreed on the number and moved on to the practical questions of the fall work ahead, and it was the most satisfying conversation he could remember having. The years after that built on each other the way good years did. The ranch grew steadily, not aggressively but soundly, the way things grew when they were tended correctly. The cooperative drive with Marcus and Rourke and Hanley became an annual arrangement, and their combined position in the San Antonio market grew stronger each year. Eli's reputation in the county grew from the quiet fact of his competence, from the quality of his cattle and his land management and his word, which was reliable. Violet continued her work with the school and continued the quiet effort of making herself useful to the women and families who had less access to what the town offered, and her reputation grew as well, not in the way of someone who sought it, but in the way of someone whose character is simply visible. Annie Travers, the schoolteacher, became a genuine friend, and their household was a frequent visitor at the Crawford table, and the friendship was one of the good constant things. Rodrigo Vasquez, who continued to run the best livery in the county, had his rates increased by the town council in 1878 at Violet's suggestion and insistence, which caused exactly the friction she had predicted, and which was resolved by the fact that she was right, and everyone who thought about it clearly knew she was right, and the matter was settled. And Rodrigo said nothing about it publicly, but the next time she brought Ginny in for shoeing he gave the mare the most meticulous attention and charged her half price, which was the way certain things were communicated between people who understood each other. Thomas Crawford grew into his serious and observant character and was in the Redemption School by 1879, where he demonstrated his mother's aptitude for learning and his father's quality of patient attention. And Miss Annie Travers told Eli and Violet at the school's first parent meeting that Thomas was one of the most naturally curious children she had taught, which made Violet's expression do the thing where it was still but inwardly very warm and made Eli look out the window for a moment. Ruth Eleanor Crawford grew into her volume and her opinions and her mother's directness, which was a very great deal of directness in a small person, and the combination of her father's steady watchfulness and her mother's clear-eyed engagement with the world produced a child who observed carefully, and then said exactly what she thought about what she had observed, and the household around her had to develop the flexibility to accommodate this. There was a morning in early spring of 1880, a Thursday in March, when Eli came in from the early work to find Violet standing at the east window of the main room with a cup of coffee, looking out at the land and the morning light on the creek, and he came and stood beside her without speaking and looked at what she was looking at, the pale and particular quality of early March light that had more warmth in it than February but had not yet committed to spring. The creek running clear and the grass just beginning to show the green that was coming, the sky vast and cloudless, and the color of something that had not been named. "Do you remember the letter?" she said after a while. He knew which letter. "I remember all of them. The one I said if you burned it I would understand." The answer was no. She held her coffee cup in both hands. "I think about it sometimes, not with bitterness, just as a fact, how close it was." "Too close," he said. "Yes." She glanced at him. "What made you not burn it?" He had thought about this before. He thought about it now, looking at the land and the morning and the thing they had built in it. "I was tired," he said finally. "Tired of being the kind of person who burned things." She nodded slowly. "That is honest. You asked me to be honest." "I did." A small pause. "I am glad you were tired." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way she did by now without thought, the easy, comfortable warmth of two people who had been each other's daily life for 6 years. Outside the window the creek caught the morning light and held it briefly before letting it go. The windmill turned. The land breathed. Thomas came in from the room he shared with Ruth, rubbing his eyes and looking for breakfast with the single-minded purpose of a 5-year-old in the morning. Ruth came behind him making a complaint about something he had done that he was denying. Cobb, who was old now and spent most of his time sleeping, opened one eye and then closed it again. Violet disengaged herself from Eli's arm with the calm practicality of a mother whose children have appeared and went to the stove, and Eli poured his own coffee and looked at his daughter, explaining her grievance to the available air, and his son eating bread with the focused efficiency of a boy who had inherited his father's quality of attention and was currently applying it to breakfast, and thought that this ordinary morning in March with the light on the creek and the sound of his children and his wife's movements at the stove was the thing he had almost not had, and felt the weight of that in the way that was not sadness but something adjacent to gratitude that had no simpler name. He thought of the letter curling in the stove, the ink turning to ash, the way he had stood at the window afterward and failed to not think about her, the 8 months of silence that had been their own kind of cruelty, the envelope arriving on a Tuesday. The first line, "Eli, I know you burned the last one." She had known, She had known, and she had written again anyway, with the courage that was hers entirely, the courage to say the true thing plainly and leave the door open one more time and trust him to walk through it. He had just barely been smart enough to walk through it. Ruth had finished her complaint and was now demanding her breakfast, and Thomas was asking about the horses, and Violet was answering both of them simultaneously with the focused competence that she brought to everything. And the stove was sending warmth across the room, and the March light was strengthening at the window, and the land outside was waking into the day. Eli set down his coffee and went to help. The years that followed were the years of the life they had built, stretching forward and back in a continuous fabric of seasons and work, and the small events that accumulated into a story. They added a proper outbuilding for storage in 1880, and a second water trough for the cattle in 1881. Thomas started helping with the early morning feeding that same year, serious and steady at 6 years old, watching his father's hands and learning the way of it. Ruth, 4 years old and convinced the ranch could not function without her opinions, informed everyone in the household that the garden needed a wider bean row and was proven correct by the harvest. In the late spring of 1882, Violet told him she was expecting a third child, with the same directness and the same morning coffee and the same absolute certainty about her own information that had preceded the first 2 announcements, and Eli said, "When?" within the first 5 seconds, which was his personal best, and Violet's expression acknowledged this without comment. The third child arrived in December, a boy, born just as the winter was settling in around the cabin. Eli's hands were cold from the morning feeding when he came in to find Dr. Haynes already there, and Clara Webb, who had ridden over before dawn, and he built the fire up and waited in the way he had twice before, doing unnecessary work in the yard, while the necessary work happened inside. When he was called in, he found Violet with the same expression of exhausted and complete satisfaction, the same warmth and directness in her eyes, the same arms already organizing around the new arrival, as if she had always known the shape of this child. They named him William Marcus Crawford, William for no reason except that it was a strong and honest name and suited him, and Marcus for the neighbor and friend who had been the closest thing Eli had had to a brother for the years he had been in redemption. Marcus Webb, when told of the name, was quietly pleased in the way of a man who is not accustomed to being honored and is uncertain what to do with it, and he shook Eli's hand and said it was a good name, and changed the subject to the question of the spring cattle count, which was exactly the right thing to do. Violet recovered from William's birth with her usual determination, and had the kitchen reorganized to accommodate 3 children by the time he was 3 weeks old. Eli built a third cradle oak again, and this one he made with carvings along the sides, small careful patterns of leaves and running water, which was not something he had planned but which appeared under his hands over the evenings of work, and which Violet looked at for a long time when he brought it in and then said, "You have been holding out on me." "What?" he said. "I did not know you could carve." "I did not know either," he said, which was mostly true. He had never had occasion to find out before. "Well," she said, and ran her fingers along the carved leaves, "he's going to have a very fine cradle." "His brother and sister will be annoyed about the cradle quality disparity," Eli said. "Probably," she agreed. "But by the time they are old enough to care about it, it will be their cradle too, and then their children's." She looked at him with the expression that still, 8 years into their life together, carried that particular quality of directness and warmth that had always been entirely hers. "We are building things that last." He thought about that for a long time in the evenings that followed, sitting on the porch with William asleep on his chest, and Thomas and Ruth arguing cheerfully about something in the yard, and Violet's voice carrying from the kitchen where she was talking to herself about the spring garden plan. The land stretched out before him in the winter afternoon, gray gold and still, the creek catching what light there was, the windmill turning, the fence lines running straight and true. He had come here in the spring of 1871 with a horse and a few tools, and the decision to build something from nothing, which was a way of saying, the decision to start over, to try to become the kind of man he wanted to be instead of the kind his circumstances had been shaping him toward. He had built the cabin and the well and the fences and the cattle operation and all the physical things that made the land into something that could support a life. And then, 8 months into a silence he was ashamed of, a woman had written him a letter and told him plainly that she knew what he had done and why he had done it, and was offering him one more chance to choose differently. He had not burned that letter. He had written back with shaking hands and inadequate words, and she had come to redemption on a Thursday in August with 2 trunks and her mother's mare and her direct, clear eyes and her willingness to build something in a place she had chosen. And the life they had made between them was the truest and best thing he had ever been part of. The baby stirred on his chest and made the sound of an infant discovering that sleep is only a temporary condition, and Eli shifted his arm to hold him more securely. And outside the yard the light was turning gold in the way it did in the winter afternoons of the Texas plains, long and level and warm in its final hour, touching everything with equal generosity. The land and the fence and the bare winter garden, and the figures of his 2 older children who had abandoned their argument, and were now looking at something in the grass, with the shared concentration of siblings who have found something interesting. He heard the door behind him, and Violet came to stand beside him on the porch with her coat pulled over her dress and her coffee cup in both hands, and she looked at the children and at the land and then at him and at the baby asleep on his chest, and she smiled the full smile, the one he had spent a long time being allowed to see, the one that was entirely and irreducibly hers. "Thomas found a horned lizard," she said. "He will want to keep it," Eli said. "He will not be keeping it," she said, but she was still smiling. "He will try to argue about it." "He will lose," she said. "I am better at arguing." "You are better at most things," Eli said. "Most things," she agreed. She leaned against him in the easy way of 8 years, her shoulder warm against his arm, her eyes on the land that was hers as much as his, the winter evening settling in around the porch and the cabin and the family and the acres of honest ground they had built their life upon together. Behind the fence the cattle were settling for the evening. The windmill turned. Thomas's voice carried across the yard, already building his case for the horned lizard. Ruth's voice answered, contradicting him. William slept on Eli's chest, with the total commitment of the very young to sleep. The sky above the western ridge was going to color, deep amber fading to something darker, the stars just beginning to appear at the edges. Everything was exactly and fully what it was. Everything had been said, and everything had been built, and all of it was good, and all of it was theirs, and all of it would continue. Eli Crawford had burned the last letter Violet Dalton sent him. She had written another. He had not burned that one. He had instead written back. And in the 8 years since that answer, in the work and the seasons and the children and the arguments and the laughter and the cold mornings and the summer evenings and the ordinary daily fact of their life together, he had been grateful for it every single day. Violet Dalton Crawford set her coffee cup on the porch rail and looked at the wide and open sky above the Texas plains and breathed in the cold, clean air of the winter evening, and felt the warmth of her husband beside her, and heard the voices of her children, and was, in the most complete and unreserved and fully resolved sense of the word, exactly where she had chosen to be. Thomas was still arguing for the lizard. Ruth was explaining very clearly why this was not going to happen. The stars were coming out one by one above the ridge. The coyotes would begin later, their distant and harmless conversation that had always been the sound of this land, had been the sound of it before the cabin and before the well and before all of it, and would be the sound of it long after. But the cabin was here now, and the family was here now, and the land knew them, the way land learned the people who tended it, and that was enough. That was everything.